The US is either screwed or we're going to win everything. There is no middle ground when it comes to artificial intelligence. There are a lot of players in this story. Open source, China, NVIDIA, the closed source US frontier labs. This is a big problem and we need to talk about it. We are betting the house on AI working out for the United States. 40% of the stock market is just 7 tech companies very tied to how AI does. And it all starts with open source. US open source AI is almost certainly doomed. And that is because there is effectively no business model that makes it work in the United States. And that's really bad because there are one of two outcomes. Either the closed source labs control everything, or China, because they are so good at open source, wins all of it. And I don't think the American public will like either of those scenarios. I made this video because I think this topic really matters. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button so we can reach more people and more people understand how severe this can get. All right, so first, what is open source? Open source artificial intelligence means the lab that made the AI also revealed its recipe, and anybody can recreate it. And they also typically give away the weights of the model. So you can download it, you can fine tune it, you can make it your own. Llama, Qwen, Gemma, Deepseek, these are all open source models. And why is open source important? Well, whenever you open source something, everybody can look at it. That makes the model more hardened from a security perspective. It makes it more efficient because everybody can figure out little techniques to make the model run better, faster, cheaper, and that is a good thing. But there is a big problem. The business model for open source AI in the United States is broken. And the reason that China seems to be eating our lunch on the open source AI front is not because we don't have the tech. It's not because we don't have the talent. It's because the funding isn't there. The monetization is not there. So imagine this. You're an AI lab. You spend months building out the recipe for a new open source model. Then you buy all the GPUs or you rent them and you bake the model. Then when you finally put it out after investing all of that R&D, after investing all of that money, everybody else can then take the model, run it themselves, or serve inference to customers that should have been yours. And here's the thing, their margins are going to be bigger because they didn't have to invest all that money into actually making the model in the first place. But how is China doing it then? Wouldn't they have the same problem? Well, to understand why open source works in China, you actually have to understand how their government works. So there is the CCP, the Chinese government, and they basically choose winners in their economy. They subsidize different companies so that they are very competitive, maybe anti-competitive in the global market. And typically, when you're behind in a competitive race on technology, the best strategy is to give it away for free. You effectively kill the margins for anybody who's in the lead. You don't need to have the best product, but if you have a really good product that also happens to be incredibly cheap, that is a winning strategy. So compare that to how America's economy works. It is a free-for-all. The US government typically does not pick winners, but that also means the business model of open source becomes much more difficult to make work. And this problem is urgent. Right now is when US businesses are deciding their AI strategy. Remember, artificial intelligence in its current form has only been around for a few years. And now, because of the slow adoption time in enterprise, they're making these decisions. And so they're looking at OpenAI's models, they're looking at Anthropic's models, and they are very expensive. They're proprietary. You have less control over them. And then they're going to look at the open source alternatives. And really, the only competitive ones are coming out of China. They're a fraction of the cost. They're almost as good. Plus, you have more control over them. You can fine tune them to your needs. You can run them locally. They are more secure because you can run them on your own servers if you want. The vast majority of businesses in the United States are not solving frontier math. They are not on the cutting edge of scientific research. And so even though GPT 5.5 or Opus 4.7 might have a higher intelligence ceiling and are better at solving some of those frontier math, frontier science problems. Most companies don't need that. 99% of use cases are just working with spreadsheets, coding, and making a schedule. These do not require frontier level intelligence. And so if the Deepseek model is just as good at everything else, 99.9% of problems out there, but it's a fraction of the cost, what do you think they're going to choose? And by the way, if you want to see the difference between open source and closed source, you can check them both out in the sponsor of today's video. Zapier released an incredible MCP service, and it includes thousands of tools that can become instantly available to your agent, whether you're using OpenClaw, Claude Code, Hermes, Cursor, any of them. You basically instantly get 8,000 plus tools that you can implement with zero code. I've actually been using Zapier for over 10 years at multiple previous businesses, and I trust them, and they have a phenomenal product. So check this out. You can connect your AI to Zapier MCP just by going into Zapier, enabling the different tools you want, like Gmail, Google Calendar, Asana, Notion, and literally 8,000 others. And then it gives you a link that's an MCP server endpoint. You give that to your agent, you just tell it to use it, and it's done. You have access to all of those tools. And Zapier has been doing automation for a very long time, so they know how to do it reliably. They have a free plan to get started and just scale up as you need after that. Check out Zapier, and they're also doing a Keeping Up with AI webinar, a live series, 4 of them, so you can learn the latest and greatest about leveraging artificial intelligence. And it's completely free. So go check it out. I'm gonna drop links down below, and now let's get back to the video. So let me lay out the US open source landscape right now. The #1 player for a while was Meta. They released Llama. They were so bullish on open source, and then they weren't. Just a year ago, Mark Zuckerberg was singing the praises, singing the benefits of open source. Fast forward 1 year later, no more open source out of Meta. Then you have OpenAI. It's literally in the name, OpenAI. But once they figured out how much money you needed to raise, they knew they needed a business model, and open source was not the way. They have released an open source model, GPT OSS, and it was pretty good. But it's certainly a side quest for them. It's not something they're doing because it is the right business model. They're doing it for goodwill, which, fine, that's part of a business strategy, but that is certainly not their focus. Then we have Anthropic, who they have no open source strategy, zero. They are like, nope, we're not even going to think about that. Straight shot to AGI. And I'll come back to that in a moment. We have Google, who actually they have a really good open source strategy, but their Gemma series of models are made to be run locally, which is awesome. Don't get me wrong. You can run it on your computer. Maybe you can also run it on your phone. And there are a lot of use cases for this, but this is not frontier intelligence. This is not meant to run a company. And then we have the last one, NVIDIA. NVIDIA might be the white knight in this story. They are investing $26 billion in building open source artificial intelligence. And they may be the only company capable of doing it. They have an incredible revenue source. They have some of the best AI researchers in the world. And most importantly, they have the incentive to do it. It's okay for them to lose a bunch of money baking an AI model if that means that the US economy and maybe the world economy is built on top of NVIDIA infrastructure. And so they make these models, spend a ton of money on it, give it away. And the problem was, well, hey, if my competitors are serving the model and they have bigger margins, that makes that business model not really work for startups. But for NVIDIA, their competitors are not their competitors. They're the ones buying NVIDIA chips. So the neoclouds, the hyperscalers, they're serving this open source model that they didn't build, but they're serving it using NVIDIA chips. So NVIDIA is upstream of all of it, and they're making money either way. So NVIDIA might be the only company where the business model for open source AI actually makes sense. All right, so why is it such a big problem if we decide to build on top of Chinese open source models? I mean, they're giving it away for free, right? We don't have to actually buy the inference from China. We don't have to send them our data. We can just host the models ourselves and serve them. And no, it is a big problem. If the United States economy is built on top of Chinese open source models, the only revenue stream we're going to have is to serve their models, to serve inference. And then all of a sudden, China is dictating AI standards. They might be optimizing their models for their own chips that they produce. And in fact, they are doing that because we have export controls that prevents NVIDIA from sending their best chips to China. So what does China do? Well, they find all these great efficiencies, these algorithmic unlocks that allow their models to be trained on their chips. Then all of a sudden, if all US enterprise is built on top of Chinese models, they have a lot of influence over the direction of the chip industry because they're building their models. If they decide, hey, we're going to optimize our model for our own chips and we're going to make our chips like this, and now all of a sudden we have to buy our AI chips from China, obviously you can see that is a big geopolitical risk. Then there's also this notion that they might be able to control cultural elements in the United States. Now, yes, when an open source, open weights model gets released, we can remove Chinese censorship, we can give it our own personality, but AI is still very much a black box. We might not be able to fully remove what China has baked into these models. And there might be subtle changes in the way we have cultural discussions in the United States based on what we learn and interact with in Chinese-based models. And of course, this also hurts the closed source AI labs because if we're not buying inference from them, they have no way to make money. And again, much of the US economy is invested in betting on the US AI, specifically the closed source labs, working out and winning. So there's kind of a double-edged sword here. On the one hand, we might be sending China a bunch of funds because we're buying their chips, we're buying their models. And then on the other hand, it also hurts US AI labs because they're closed source and we're just not buying them because they're so expensive. But maybe none of this matters. Maybe the straight shot to AGI is the only thing that matters. That is certainly an argument. Okay, so maybe it all doesn't matter, but why? Well, Dario and the entire Anthropic company believe there is only one thing that matters, and that is straight shot to AGI. That's the only thing that matters because once one company reaches AGI, they're in the hard takeoff. Nobody else can catch up. And from then on, they basically own everything. For Anthropic, they have this gorgeous flywheel that I've talked about numerous times in videos where they have a coding model, they sell the coding model to enterprise companies and make a ton of money. They're at 30 billion ARR right now. They take all of that data plus the coding model itself and build the next generation of that model. And that is that self-improvement, that recursive loop that we've talked about for AI. And it's incredibly powerful. So really, maybe it doesn't matter because once Anthropic or once OpenAI reaches AGI, once they reach that recursive self-improving loop for AI, nothing else matters. They can develop the cheapest models. They can develop all of these efficiency strategies. They can solve cancer. I mean, they can literally do anything. Once you have unlimited intelligence that is capable of thinking through any problem, it's really just, that's it. You're done. And so that is the counter argument for how important US open source AI is. But here's the thing, that's just one potential outcome. And we don't know how long that's going to take. And in the interim, if US enterprises using Chinese open source models, and then all of a sudden China gets to dictate and influence the future direction of artificial intelligence on chip production, chip manufacturing, all of a sudden we're in a very bad spot because that disrupts the flywheel that allows an Anthropic, that allows an OpenAI to reach AGI, to reach ASI, artificial superintelligence. And so we need to fix open source AI in America. One potential way is obviously just NVIDIA. NVIDIA might be the savior. They have all the money, all the researchers, all the incentive, right? Show me incentive, I'll show you an outcome. They have everything they need to continue to bet big on open source with their Nematron family of models. But they can't be the only ones. We need startups. Small businesses are the lifeblood of the United States economy. So a few options I'm going to throw out there. One, maybe we have federal grants or some kind of federal compute quota for specifically open source AI companies. Open source AI is a public good. So the federal government helping subsidize it would actually be kind of a good thing. Now, typically, I am not in favor of the US government picking winners. But in this case, it's open source. It is a standard and it is a public good, so there might be actually a valid reason to do so. Next, we can treat open source as national infrastructure, tax credits, accelerated depreciation, and sovereign procurement guarantees for US open source models in defense, in healthcare, finance, and energy. If we want a thriving US open source AI economy, we actually have to buy from US open source AI companies. We can also lean into the hardware funded model like NVIDIA. Why isn't AMD doing this? Why isn't Intel doing this? They should be betting big on open source also. Because again, if you're building open source as a hardware company, you can optimize the models for your own hardware and then sell your hardware to run it. It's a great business model. Another solution is let's stop competing with general closed source models. These closed source models are incredible. They are great at the absolute frontier of knowledge, but most people and most companies don't need that. So let's build smaller, more efficient, vertical application models. So legal, biotech, code, defense, we can build vertical versions of these open source models specific for these industries. Cheaper, better, faster. And finally, what we've seen work really well in the past, especially for open source, is defining standards. It might be a little bit early to define standards for AI, but it is certainly helpful. Instead of all of these open source AI labs, startups competing against each other and having to define everything themselves, which is very costly and very time intensive, if we had standards to build off of, it would save them a ton of time and money, and they can get to market much more easily. And by the way, the entire idea for this video came from something that happened just a few days ago. Deepseek released an incredible model, basically validating every point I made in this video. Check it out right here.